Hi, welcome to this presentation on sexual exploitation and trafficking in Minnesota. My name is Sarah Florman, and I'm the Trafficking Policy Coordinator at the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. The objectives for this presentation are to define sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, to recognize the risk factors and dynamics, to describe Minnesota's safe harbor law, and to identify some ways that advocates can meet the needs of victim survivors of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. First, let's define sexual exploitation and trafficking and examine the differences between the terms. In Minnesota, when we talk about sexual exploitation, we're usually referring to commercial sexual exploitation. The distinction is that commercial sexual exploitation involves the exchange of sex for something of value. A transaction is taking place. According to the Minnesota Department of Health, minor commercial sexual exploitation occurs when someone under the age of 18 engages in commercial sexual activity. A commercial sexual activity occurs when anything of value or a promise of anything of value, such as money, drugs, food, shelter, rent, or higher status in a gang or group, is given to a person by any means in exchange for any type of sexual activity. A third party may or may not be involved. The concept of a third party is the primary differentiation between sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. Sex trafficking involves a third party who is benefiting from the transaction. Sexual exploitation is a big issue, encompassing a wide range of issues related to sexual violence, including sexual abuse and assault, as well as sexual harassment. Commercial sexual exploitation is a subset within this category and includes things like survival sex, stripping, pornography, and transactional sex, which is sometimes referred to as prostitution. Sex trafficking is a type of commercial sexual exploitation, and it requires the involvement of a third party, often referred to as the trafficker, who facilitates or profits from the transaction. This could include posting online ads for another person or providing transportation for someone to engage in commercial sexual activity. This graphic provides a simplified explanation of the differences between sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. But in reality, these issues are really nuanced, and it might be difficult to determine whether there's a trafficker involved in any given situation. When talking about sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, one of the first questions that I'm usually asked is, who is at risk? You've likely seen images of trafficking victims portrayed in the media. These often include common themes or stereotypes, such as young white girls being physically bound with ropes or chains or otherwise physically restrained with their hands, with someone's hands, or with tape over their mouths. They also often depict imagery of street-level prostitution. The victims in these images show a desire or a need to be rescued, and they may use images like barcodes or words like slavery. You might also see various facts and statistics, often without cited sources. These representations are harmful to victim survivors of trafficking and exploitation, as they portray an unrealistic image of victims, causing real victims to remain unseen and unidentified. Organizations hoping to draw awareness to the issues of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking might use these images in an effort to build awareness. They also might frequently use statistics to increase a community's concern about the issue. But the truth is, the existing data on this topic is incomplete, and many groups are underrepresented, giving an inaccurate picture of the scope of the problem. Although the highest percentage of documented, identified victims of exploitation and trafficking are girls of color from poor communities, young people of all demographics are potentially at risk, and many are often underrepresented in the data. This includes boys and gender nonconforming youth, LGBTQ plus youth, young people from middle to upper class families, all races and all ages. A 2018 study identified the top 5 risk factors for youth to be sex trafficked and found that they're the same across geographic spaces. The top 5 risk factors are a history of either physical or sexual abuse, or both, family instability or dysfunction, habitual running away from home, family housing instability or homelessness, and drug or alcohol addiction. There are a number of other risk factors that make young people and people of any age vulnerable to traffickers. Some of these additional risk factors are things like poverty, lack of resources or support systems within a community, parent or guardian addiction to drugs or alcohol, a history of out-of-home placement or child protection involvement, being a school dropout, drug or alcohol dependency of the youth, mental health issues, lack of support systems either inside or outside the home, emotional distress, which often includes simply being a young person, and being a member of an oppressed population. Young people can be at risk if they have a family member who's been involved in trafficking historically, either as a trafficker or as someone who has been trafficked. Gang involvement can be a risk factor, and then a lack of support systems and trusted adults to turn to. And immigration status can also be a risk factor. Next, we'll focus specifically on the dynamics of sex trafficking and the overall process of becoming involved in trafficking. Traffickers generally use a process that includes 3 phases. And this process may appear somewhat different case by case, but the foundation remains the same. Traffickers will begin by recruiting victims. They then move into the initiation phase or breaking. Finally, followed by barriers to escape and imposing methods of control. There are a number of common methods of recruitment. This could involve a relationship with someone involved in prostitution or trafficking. This could be a family member, a boyfriend, or a girlfriend. Survival sex is often an entry point into vulnerability to trafficking, and coercion using drugs and alcohol. There are situations where involvement in trafficking or exploitation might be the norm in a family, or a parent may have a drug or alcohol addiction or need extra income. A boyfriend or girlfriend might start as a typical relationship and then evolve into a trafficking relationship. Other methods of recruitment include being lured through promises of work or benefits. Youth might start working as dancers in strip clubs or respond to advertisements for modeling work. Social media is also a major area where recruitment takes place. This can include online relationships and meetups, and predators can pose as anyone online. This includes the usual suspects like Facebook, Snapchat, and Twitter, but it also includes gaming sites and apps with chat capabilities. So multiplayer games, words with friends, etc. Any app that allows you to communicate with other users. Also be aware that there are apps that masquerade as other apps that you can use to hide the apps on your phone. Young people have found a number of ways to hide these interactions. The next phase is initiation and breaking. This begins often with isolation, and this can include social isolation as well as physical. To socially isolate someone, you separate that person from their friends and family. You might say things like, they don't understand you or love you like I do. You might take away or monitor their cell phone and social media. Physical isolation can be as simple as not allowing someone to go anywhere alone, not allowing the victim to see their friends or family, or might physically move them away from the area. Physical isolation can also include taking identifying documents like driver's license, social security cards, or immigration papers. Abuse can include interpersonal violence or coercion. There can be harm or threats of harm to the victim or the victim's family. Another common way to break a victim into the trafficking life is to get them hooked on drugs or alcohol. This makes them more compliant, and the victim may go along to feed that addiction. This can lead to long-term harms of all sorts, including criminal charges, inability to hold a job, lack of access to housing, and simply being less credible as witnesses. A partner may blackmail a trafficking victim by taking nude photos and using them to gain compliance. Traffickers exploit feelings of worthlessness. They say things like, you're damaged goods, no one else will want you. They might threaten criminal prosecution or deportation for drugs or other crimes. They might say, I'll call ICE and report you. They exploit the trauma bond, saying things like, I love you, no one cares about you like I do. They might give the victim a new name or identity, furthering the erasure of their old self. They might also use tattoos or branding, such as the trafficker's name or symbol, which signifies ownership. This has historically been viewed as a common practice by traffickers, but in recent years appears to be less common. How do traffickers sustain that relationship? They continue their use of the breaking techniques, ongoing harm and threat of harm, variety of abuse and emotional abuse and manipulation, ongoing actual or threat of abuse or torture to themselves or family members. They might make an example out of another victim to show the young person what will happen if they try to leave. And they might withhold money or identity documents, which basically prevents someone from being able to gain employment, gain housing, or survive without the trafficker. Other methods of control include threats to family or children, causing and exploiting a pregnancy, pressure and guilt by playing the friendship or boyfriend card. If you love me, you would do this for me, is a common phrase used. Methods of control might also involve what's called a bottom relationship, where one victim is promoted above the other victims and is used to help keep the other victims in line. And that person is now complicit in the crime, and it's difficult to find the line. So it's easier for traffickers to say, you can't turn me in because you'll get in trouble as well. Anyone and everyone has access to transactional sex, but research has shown that buyers tend to be white, married men from middle and upper socioeconomic backgrounds. These folks are often respected, influential people in their communities and have lots of power and privilege. Most buyers don't purchase sex where they live. They typically travel an average of 30 to 60 miles. Where does it happen? Trafficking is happening all around you. It's happening in malls, airports, clubs, shelters, parks, and on the street. There are a number of myths surrounding where and when trafficking occurs, such as the myth that the Super Bowl is the biggest trafficking event of the year in America. And although there is increased trafficking incidents in large situations like the Super Bowl, this increase occurs anytime there's a large event in any particular area where lots of people are coming in from out of town. This means that hunting resorts and lodges are also prime areas for trafficking to occur. There are also a number of massage parlors in suburban Minnesota where trafficking occurs daily. Now let's discuss some information to help advocates who are working with sexually exploited or trafficked youth. It's important to be aware that victim survivors you work with may also be victims of trafficking or exploitation, and you may or may not know in advance that the person you're working with was exploited or trafficked. And it might or might not be directly related to the situation that brought you into their life. We'll start with a few terms. There are a variety of acronyms that service providers across the country use when referring to sexually exploited or trafficked youth. These are the three most common terms that you'll come across. There's SEY, which stands for Sexually Exploited Youth, CSEC, meaning Commercial Sexual Exploited Child, and DMST for Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking. In Minnesota, you'll most frequently see SEY used, and this term is inclusive to youth who've been trafficked as well. The same 2018 study I mentioned earlier also identified the top 5 indicators that a youth may be a victim of sex trafficking, and again found that they're the same across geographic spaces. Those indicators are having been sexually assaulted, having existing mental health concerns, a drug or alcohol abuse or overdose, chronic runaway, and untreated STIs. There are a number of additional indicators that may occur, including money or phones or other items of value that cannot be explained or accounted for, posting sexually explicit materials online, or engaging in a relationship with an older partner or unwilling to provide information about their partner. While keeping these indicators in mind, it's important to also be aware that you may encounter someone being exploited or trafficked that displays none of these warning signs. There are a number of factors that make identification and service provision difficult for victim survivors of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. Many of these characteristics also make victims of exploitation and trafficking more vulnerable to becoming involved in other systems, such as criminal justice or child protection. This might include the fact that the victim survivor might not think they've been exploited or trafficked. They might refuse help or defend their trafficker. They might not be compliant with law enforcement or advocacy. These youth may not think of themselves as victims. They might feel that they're being independent and surviving. These youth may not want to be saved or rescued, and they often go through multiple cycles of leaving and returning. Because these folks don't present as typical victims and often express that they have chosen to engage in these activities, it's really important to remember what does and does not constitute a real choice. It's not a choice if the choice to leave is removed. If the choice is between something you don't want to do and something that is harmful. If the choice is between something harmful and something even more harmful. If the terms under which you made your original choice were changed by someone in a position of power. It's not a choice if this is your only choice. Or if harm has been normalized as a choice. Under Minnesota law, sex trafficking is defined as receiving, recruiting, enticing, harboring, providing, or obtaining by any means an individual to aid in the prostitution of the individual, or receiving profit or anything of value, knowing or having reason to know it is derived from prostitution. Sex trafficking is a mandated report to child protection for youth under age 18, and child protection is required to investigate all alleged trafficking. Sexual exploitation, however, is not a mandated report and does not require an automatic investigation. In Minnesota, child protection and child welfare agencies are able to offer resources and support through the Safe Harbor Network to youth who've been sexually exploited. And this highlights the importance of understanding that distinction between exploitation and trafficking that was discussed earlier in this presentation. What makes Minnesota law different? We've removed the requirement of force, fraud, or coercion that exists in the federal definition. Minnesota's law does not require a showing of force, fraud, or coercion for victims of any age. In Minnesota, we recognize that a person can be exploited in a variety of ways, including but not always involving force, fraud, or coercion. By removing this requirement, the focus was placed on the actions of the trafficker or the person doing the exploiting. It also means that a person's prior involvement in prostitution or their apparent consent to being exploited is not a defense to the charge of trafficking. Even so, there are still many multidisciplinary partners, community leaders, and members of the general public who do not know how Minnesota law defines trafficking, and many victims continue to go unidentified. Prior to passing Minnesota's Safe Harbor law for sexually exploited youth, we had a conflict in our state laws. A juvenile under the age of 18 engaging in prostitution was at the same time a victim and a criminal. Buying a minor was a felony offense, and so, of course, was trafficking a minor. However, youth could still be arrested for engaging in prostitution. You can see how this creates a problem depending on who is enforcing the law. Some investigators and prosecutors recognized a sexually exploited youth as a victim, while others were of the mindset that if money exchanged hands, the youth was a child prostitute and not a true victim. As a state, we had to change the way we viewed youth who were engaged in prostitution, not as child prostitutes, but as victims of sexual exploitation and trafficking. By decriminalizing prostitution for youth under the age of 18, Minnesota's Safe Harbor law changed the state's legal response, but also forced everyone to change the way they thought about sexual exploitation. Minnesota's Safe Harbor law is a statewide effort that recognizes that juveniles who are commercially sexually exploited as victims and not as criminals, and directs them to services and away from criminal sanctions. Commercially sexually exploited youth who are under 18 years old can no longer be criminalized for engaging in prostitution and instead should be referred to services. They can no longer be found guilty of their own sexual exploitation. While this conflict was resolved for juveniles, it still exists for adult victims of trafficking. Prior to the Safe Harbor law, many prosecutors were not prosecuting juvenile victims of trafficking for engaging in prostitution, and some law enforcement officers who would find victims would try to find them services and avoid arresting them. However, the threat of delinquency charges was sometimes used as a tool to obtain cooperation. The goal of the arrest or detention would be to keep the victim safe from their pimp or safe from the streets, and officers would often say that it was sometimes the only way to keep that victim safe. With the implementation of the Safe Harbor law, the state has incorporated a number of services, including housing and shelter, regional navigators, and a statewide director to oversee all of these services. The Safe Harbor Network is a cooperative effort between the Minnesota Department of Health, the Department of Human Services, and the Department of Public Safety. The Department of Health involves the Safe Harbor Director, oversees the regional navigators, and specialized services grants. DHS provides housing and shelter grants. And DPS includes the statewide task force out of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and training for law enforcement across the state. In addition to the three government bodies, MNCASA also participates in the Safe Harbor Network by providing guidance, training, and support on developing community protocols to respond to sexual exploitation and trafficking in communities. Victims, survivors of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation may encounter the criminal justice system in different ways. They may be a victim of exploitation or trafficking, or a victim of another crime. They may also be the one that's charged for drug and alcohol offenses or peripheral crimes such as check fraud, theft, etc., that they may have been directed to engage in by their trafficker. In addition, there may be victims who are bottoms in a relationship who are then charged with exploitation or trafficking themselves. When meeting the needs of victims, you want to think about three things. Consider safety, which involves safety planning, including shelter, geography, safe locations, and determining when to involve law enforcement. It might involve restraining orders or order for protection. It might involve mandated reporting. The next need is survival. So the victim might need housing or employment, benefits, education. They might need legal assistance for a variety of issues. And that victim survivor will also need support. That might include one-on-one support or groups, therapy, aftercare groups, chemical dependency treatment, mental health services, and issues with identity. Responding to the complex trauma of survivors of exploitation and trafficking is a complex issue that takes a lot of time and takes a variety of community members and services. Thank you for viewing this presentation on sexual exploitation and trafficking in Minnesota. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or would like additional resources.